Hey guys, today we're going to be talking about the different builds for the Elemental Shaman in 11.0.5. Now, before we get into it, I just want to say there's a bunch of different variations on each of these builds that move maybe one or two talent points around, but don't have any real impact on gameplay or even performance. So we're not going to talk about every single possible talent combination that we can use because we'll just be here all day and won't really have gained any like real benefit or knowledge. So we're gonna skip over most of that. I'll talk about some of the variations, but for the most part, we're gonna be kind of sticking to the major archetypes of the builds, the things that actually affect gameplay. So I'll be mainly talking about like one single target build and then kind of talk about the variations within that. But then for Mythic Plus, we have basically four different archetypes that center around two talents. And those two talents are Echoes of the Great Sundering and Primordial Wave / Liquid Magma Totem. I'm kind of thinking of that as like one package in Mythic Plus. So there are builds that use Echoes of the Great Sundering and just that, some that use just Primordial Wave and Liquid Magma Totem, some that use neither one of those two things, and some that use both of them. So those are kind of the four distinct builds we'll talk about for Mythic Plus. But again, there's a lot of different ways that you can approach it, things that you can move around even within that, and still get really good results. Obviously, some of these builds have, especially for Mythic Plus, have better AoE, but better, and then some have better single target. Some are better for certain situations. But really, in the big broad strokes, you can play any of these builds and get good results. I'd highly suggest like playing with different ones, seeing which ones work for you and which ones you enjoy playing the most, and kind of going from there. So with that being said, we're going to start with the single target first, get that out of the way, and go into the Mythic Plus builds and the AoE builds after that. The big thing to keep in mind with all of these different builds is Ellie plays the same pretty much regardless of builds right now. You're just kind of tacking on either Echoes of the Great Sundering or Primordial Wave that kind of change that interaction even just like in a very small amount of way. I don't want to use the word complexity because it's not really making it more complex. You're just having to think about maybe one or two things every now and then that change the way that you're approaching elemental. But in large strokes, there's no like fire builds and lightning builds that play completely differently anymore. AoE is basically going to feel the same in all situations, regardless of build. Same thing in single target. And pretty much we're going to be using Stormbringer for all of these builds. Farseer is not quite up to snuff yet to where we can really get a good usage out of it. So Stormbringer is pretty much all we're going to be playing. So things are going to feel fairly similar across all of these builds. You're just adding little things here and there. So with that being said, we're going to start off with a single target, like I said, and then we'll move into Mythic Plus. All right, so for single target. So before we get into the build, let's talk about the Stormbringer tree real quick. We're going to be using this for every single build, regardless of single target or Mythic Plus. The main things we just want to make sure we're always taking our Supercharge and our Nature's Protection over the other options. And then for the movement speed one, you can play whichever one you prefer. I like knowing when it's going to happen, so I like using Electroshock. However, Lightning Conduit can definitely be fun. So whichever one you prefer, you can play those. So that's pretty much it for Stormbringer. This is our raid default build here. There's a couple different talent points that we can change if we would like, though it does not affect the gameplay at all. We could move Searing Flames and Thunderstrike Ward into Everlasting Elementals and Earthen Rage, and it's the exact same playstyle. Looks a little bit different, but it kind of zeroes out to be about the same. If you want to play that, that's totally fine. You can also play with either Earthshock or Elemental Blast. However, they're so close together, I would highly suggest playing Earthshock. It's easier to deal with. You can have higher uptime on your Lightning Rod, which shouldn't be a problem either way, but regardless, it just makes it a little bit easier. You can also cast it while moving. There's a bunch of different reasons why Earthshock is going to be better in the long term. However, if you prefer playing Elemental Blast, you can play that without much of a downside to your damage. It basically comes out the same. There's a couple of other talents we can move around as well. However, we're not going to get into that today. This is basically what I would suggest. And the gameplay is essentially to line up all of your cooldowns whenever you can. We kind of have like 4 major cooldowns that we're trying to line up whenever possible around your big cooldown of Ascendance. So we have Ascendance, we have Storm Elemental, Stormkeeper, and Primordial Wave is the things we want to try to overlap whenever we can. But outside of that Ascendance window, that 3-minute Ascendance window, we kind of want to just be using everything on cooldown. I'll talk a little bit more about Storm Elemental usage since it's not quite 3 minutes when we get into it, or I can just go ahead and say it. Basically, we want to line these two things up whenever we can. But if you're going to be missing, or if you could get an extra cast by just using this on cooldown, you can do that. You don't have to line these two up, though it definitely feels better to do that if you can, is to just line these two things up. However, if you can if you can squeeze out an extra cast by casting this on cooldown, then it's better to do that. But in general, you want to just keep these lined up. I think that's probably the easier way to play, is to just always have these things lined up together. But again, just want to make that noted. As far as general playstyle in just throughout the spec, you want to be basically using what you have at all times. So if you have a Lava Burst, make sure you're using those. If you have Ice Furies, make sure you're using those. The one thing I will say about Ice Fury is you don't want to use them back to back. You can have up to 2 charges of Ice Fury, but between each Ice Fury, you want to make sure you actually trigger your Fusion of the Elements, which is after using Ice Fury, the next time that you cast a damaging nature and fire spell, you also cast an elemental blast. So you want to make sure that if you do cast an Ice Fury, make sure you're using a nature and fire spell before you cast the next one. So if you get Ice Fury, if it procs, you want to be using a Lava Burst and a Lightning Bolt or an Earthshock before you cast the next Ice Fury. Sounds a little bit more complicated. This might be the only real complexity that Ellie has, is just kind of keeping track of that and making sure you are using that. But at the end of the day, it's really not that complicated. You just never want to press Ice Fury back to back. But that's kind of the general idea of Ellie. It's not going to make sense when I'm just staring at it like this. So let's go ahead and talk about it from an actual practical situation. We'll do it on a target dummy and go from there. All right, so this is how we're going to play it in single target. So first and foremost, I do want to just talk real quick about the opener. There's a couple different versions of the opener you can do. However, it's not really going to make a big impact on your overall damage one way or the other. And no matter what I say about the opener, someone's going to say I'm saying it wrong. I'm just going to say there's a couple different variations of it you can do. Some that you do 4 lightning bolts with Storm Elemental out before you get going, some with only 1. We're just going to do the easy thing and just press things as they come up, essentially, and just kind of get going ASAP. That's the opener we're going to do because it's the most simple version of it, and it requires the least amount of thought, and it's not going to make a big difference one way or the other over your DPS, so that's why we're doing it this way. So what we're going to do to get started, about 3 seconds before the pull, we're going to be using our Storm Elemental. We're going to go directly into a Storm Keeper. And then on the pull, we'll use our Primordial Wave. And this is where Ascendance and your Trinket and your Potion is right at this moment. And then we're going to go into our Ascendance. So we got Primordial Wave out, and now we're going to press Ascendance. And now the first thing we're going to do is trigger the first Lava Burst to get the Splintered Elements rolling. And now we're just going to start pressing things as they pop up in the priority of basically if Ice Fury is up and you don't already have one out, press that. If you have a Lava Burst, press that. Otherwise, you're pressing Lightning Bolt. We do want to get our first Earthshock out ASAP so that we can get that Lightning Rod on the target, but past that, it's going to be up pretty much most of the time anyway, so you don't have to think about it too hard. So I do have an Ice Fury, so I'm going to go ahead and use that. Into a Lava Burst, into an Earthshock. Now I have Lightning Rod on this target. I do have another Lava Burst cast, so I'm going to go ahead and do that. And now I'm going to start, after this, I have nothing else to press. I'm going to start spamming out Lightning Bolts. So Lava Burst, I do proc a Tempest. Tempest, for the sake of single target, you basically just think of as another Lightning Bolt. If it procs, you just press it. That's really the end of that's the end all be all of that. So Tempest proc, I just use it and start spamming out those Lightning Bolts. I get another Ice Fury. I'm going to go ahead and use that into a Lava Burst, into an Earthshock. That procs everything, so we're all up to date there. So just start spamming out Lightning Bolts. Get another Ice Fury. Going to use that right away, and right as the Ascendance is wearing off, if you don't think you can finish getting out another cast in it, just go ahead and get some instant cast out, whether it be Lava Burst or Earthshock or a Nature Swiftness Tempest, something like that. Typically, you want to try to fit in 1 extra Earthshock, so that's what I'm going to do right here. Just going to get 1 Earthshock out right before it expires, and then basically we're just going to be continuing pressing things as they appear moving forward. So at this point, we can just basically just keep pressing our buttons, what we have available to us. If we have a Lava Burst available, then we can go ahead and use that. If you have Ice Fury, that's going to take the most precedent. You'll notice that I have Primordial Wave coming off cooldown here. I just use it the second it comes up. Primordial Wave and Stormkeeper, you can basically just press as they come up for most of the time outside of your cooldowns. If you're approaching a cooldown window, that's when you can hold them. But you really don't want to be holding them for that long, especially if you're going to be losing a cast. You definitely don't want to be holding them. Outside of that, you're basically just pressing what is up. If you have Ice Fury or Lava Burst, you press that over Lightning Bolt. That's the best way to think of it. Yes, I am actively trying to master the elements buff my spenders, but in generally speaking, you can really just press Lava Burst whenever, and then just hold off on spending a spender when you actually have a Lava Burst to use to moat buff it. But even then, if you're ignoring moat buff and just kind of using it on cooldown, it's not going to make a huge difference. you can just basically just keep thinking of getting rid of things ASAP. The other thing I am doing in this is when Primordial Wave is about to come off cooldown, I'm not going to be recasting Flame Shock. And the main reason for that is it's just not really worth it to do that. It's better to just wait for the Primordial Wave. If you're someone who is extra, like, really like, or just like super anal about keeping Flame Shock on your target at all times, it's not going to hurt your damage to do that. You don't have to worry about that. If you want to keep Flame Shock up 100% of the time, you can do that. If it's coming up, if Primordial Wave is coming up fairly quickly, I would say to just wait. But if it's like going to be like 14 seconds before the next Primordial Wave, you can throw out Flame Shock. It's not going to hurt your damage one way or the other. But that's pretty much it. I think it's fairly simple. I will say the Ice Fury definitely takes some practice to mentally get into that zone of pressing it. Make sure you get a Lava Burst or a Lightning Bolt before pressing another one. You could also press Flame Shock if you just don't want to think about it. If you want to just press your Ice Fury and immediately press Flame Shock or Primordial Wave, both of those count as both fire and nature spells. So you can just press one button and have it trigger. You can always do that too, but it's really not that big of a deal. There is a weak ore out there. I just don't have it. I don't feel like I really need to use it. There's probably a good weak ore out there for that. If you need something to make sure that to track which ones you have already done, lightning and fire. But in general, fairly easy playstyle. Once you get it down, if it's kind of confusing, make sure you spend some time on a target dummy and kind of go from there. But that's basically the end all be all of it. Make sure you're lining up those cooldowns, especially at the start of the fight, and then kind of use everything on cooldown. When you're coming up to the next Ascendance window, you can hold your Storm Elemental to line up with that. It waits for like 30 seconds, essentially, but you can reline those things up if you'd like to do that. Probably worth doing unless you're going to lose a cast of Storm Elemental. So that's pretty much for single target, and now we will move into AoE and Mythic Plus stuff. All right, so for Mythic Plus, we have 4 builds that we're going to talk about today. They're all fairly similar, but play slightly different, so we're going to kind of break them out just a little bit. This first one is what we call like the Smooth Brain build, and the main reason for that is because you'll notice we are not taking Echoes of the Great Sundering, we are not taking Primordial Wave or Liquid Magma Totem, which means that in AoE, all that we're doing is just Chain Lightning and Earthquake, Chain Lightning and Earthquake, Chain Lightning and Earthquake, and that is all you have to think about. It's a very simple build. It gets results. It really just kind of benefits the most in AoE and pure AoE. It's doesn't really require too much thought, and probably would be what I would suggest playing if you're still kind of confused on the general way of how LE works, and you can kind of think about how you can add in other things as almost like the other parts of the builds, the Liquid Magma Totem, the Echoes of the Great Sundering. If you want to start learning how to play them, you can kind of think of them being modularly based on this build, and you're just adding pieces to it. So you would do everything you were doing in this build, but if you take Echoes of the Great Sundering, you're just kind of adding that to it. If you're taking Primordial Wave and Liquid Magma Totem, you're adding on to this core base of the build. So we'll start talking about this one first, and we'll work our way through it. But just really quick, just to see how different or similar these builds are, the only difference between like the Smooth Brain build and the full AoE build is 2 talents. We're just moving a couple pieces over so that we have our Thunderstrike Ward and our Echoes of the Great Sundering. That's the only thing that is being changed. Which is being moved over from these 2 talents right here, just so you can see it. Those are the only things that we move. So you have a little bit less in your burst window. However, you're getting a lot more out of Echoes of the Great Sundering, but you're having to go back and forth between Earthshock and Earthquake in AoE. So just one little bit of added complexity. Then there's the Earthshock, Liquid Magma Totem, and Pwave style of play. I couldn't come up with a better name for it, which is very similar to what you've seen with the full single target build. Very, very, very close to that. We're just adding in Charged Conduit. So it's basically playing the same way. However, now we have the package of Liquid Magma Totem and Primordial Wave, so spreading out those Flame Shocks during your Primordial Wave window, but you're still just spamming out those Earthquakes because we're not using Echoes of the Great Sundering. But then finally we have what I've heard as being called the Chinese build. This is where it had spread from, and this is actually the build I've been playing out the most. However, it definitely has the most going on. You'll notice it changed over to Elemental Blast. We have Echoes of the Great Sundering, and we have Primordial Wave. So this build is definitely not something I would start with if you're not comfortable with Elemental. It's much slower paced, but still can provide really, really powerful results in AoE. And probably more important, and the main reason to play this build, is it has really good single target and 2-target cleave comparatively to the other builds. You have very good priority damage with Elemental Blast, as well as you have Echoes of the Great Sundering, which especially when paired with Aftershock, can do insane amounts of damage with good procs during your Ascendance window. This can be very hit and miss. If you're doing really low keys, I would definitely not suggest it, because it can take so long to build up to an Elemental Blast that in some packs you might be doing like under tank damage. I mean, that happens in my own keys too. There are sometimes when you have like a really small pack and you've used all of your cooldowns, sometimes you just don't get the good rolls and you'll be doing really bad damage. But then on the same side of, or the opposite side of that coin, is that sometimes you'll do insanely powerful damage and it'll come out doing overall probably better than average. So I definitely like this build. I will say all 4 of these builds have their pros and cons. The Smooth Brain build definitely having the least amount of cognitive load, so you don't have to worry about too much while this is going on. Definitely something to consider. So with that being said, we're going to go ahead and jump into it. Oh, one extra thing I was almost forgot to mention is Surge of Power. A lot of builds previously had been using Surge of Power. You can still play these Surge of Power in every single one of these builds. You'll notice that I didn't include it in any of these builds because the pros and cons of using Surge of Power, they are very similar in damage output. They might have more consistently good AoE. However, they definitely lack in the single target department, and the ability to just high roll on Aftershock definitely makes up for the static benefit of Surge of Power. I can't recommend playing Surge of Power in any situation, especially if you're someone watching a YouTube guide. I would definitely say play Aftershock. I play Aftershock in all my builds. It's just one less thing to think about, and there's really no measurable difference in overall damage that I have found across multiple runs. You might find one person who did really well with Surge of Power and someone who did really poorly with Aftershock, but it's not necessarily that talent that's all of that weight. There's so many other procs, especially when you have DRE at play. Procs are going to be hugely important to your overall performance. So I would say, with that being said, Aftershock is just straight better because it's way better in single target and can come out fairly equally in AoE. Probably way too many words for that one talent, but I know some people will ask about it. So with that being said, we will go ahead and talk about how the Smooth Brain build actually plays. Alright, so getting into the Smooth Brain build, what we're going to do is as we approach a pack, I'm assuming that we are already in combat, we're just going to start getting things going. We're going to be using our Storm Elemental and our Storm Keeper right away. I'm assuming the Pank is already pulling at this point. We're going to go ahead and pop our Ascendance, and now we're going to be spamming out Chain Lightning and Earthquake, and Chain Lightning and Earthquake. If we get a Tempest proc, we're going to use that pretty much immediately. What I would suggest doing, even if you're well, if you're still trying to get used to it, you don't have to worry about this, but you can spread your lightning rods with your Tempest. Just be aware of that. So if you are in a situation where you're trying to get better with every aspect of it, start trying to get used to using your Tempest on targets that don't have your lightning rod yet. If you're still learning, don't worry about that quite yet, but that's something to grow into. So you'll notice I'm switching targets to a target that doesn't have a lightning rod, using a Tempest, and then using a Chain Lightning. I get another Tempest proc. We want to use that pretty quickly. So I'm going to be targeting one additional one that doesn't have one. Actually, in this situation, all 5 of them have lightning rods going, so I'm just going to use it on one of the lower ones here, and then going back to Chain Lightnings. Again, you do not have to worry about it. Let's back up a little bit because I feel like I overcomplicated it already. You don't have to worry about that if you don't want to. If you really want to just think about it as super easy mode, what you can do is use your cooldowns: Storm Elemental, Storm Keeper, Proc Ascendance, Chain Lightning, Earthquake, Earthquake. Use your Tempest when it comes out. Just think of it as just using it. Go back to Chain Lightning, proc another Tempest, just use it. Chain Lightning, Earthquake, Earthquake, Earthquake. As soon as you have the ability to use an Earthquake, just go ahead and spam it out there, especially during your Ascendance window, because you're getting all of those Earthquakes on the ground there, and then just spamming out Chain Lightnings. That is all you're having to worry about. You don't have to think about anything else while you're doing it. If you need to move, if you need to fill in a spot with a global, since pretty much everything that you're casting does have a cast time, obviously Earthquake doesn't, but if you need to move, you can throw out an Ice Fury, you can throw out a Flame Shock if you need to, but for the most part, you're just going to be Chain Lightning and Earthquaking. Always remember that you have Spirit Walker's Grace in case you need to move, so you can just keep doing that, especially during your Ascendance window. You don't want to be losing time during your Ascendance window to be like casting or like trying to worry about like using instant cast to move around. Just use your Spirit Walker's Grace to maximize your uptime on your Ascendance window. And then just spam Chain Lightning and Earthquake, and that's it. That's the whole thing. You don't have to think too much harder on this one. All right, so getting into the, quote, full AoE build, this is just Smooth Brain plus Echoes of the Great Sundering. The big difference here is we will now have to care a little bit more about those lightning rods. However, if you don't want to worry about that quite yet, you don't necessarily have to. But this is where it starts mattering a little bit more, because you don't want to be just earth-shocking the same target over and over again, refreshing it on that same one, unless you have a priority target that needs to die quickly. However, in general, you want to spread those lightning rods out. So I will be doing that the same way I was doing it in the first side of the video, or the previous video, but just I'm not going to talk about it because I don't want to overcomplicate things. So Storm Elemental, Stormkeeper, Proccing Ascendance, Chain Lightning, Earth Shock, we're doing that first this time, Chain Lightning and Earthquake, and then we're just going back and forth. So I build up Chain Lightnings, use Earth Shock, Chain Lightnings, use Earthquake, Chain Lightnings, use Earth Shock, Earthquake, Chain Lightnings, more Chain Lightnings, build that back up. Use another Earth Shock, more Chain Lightnings. I gotta get Tempest, make sure you're using those procs as well. Use an Earthquake, Chain Lightnings, Earth Shock, Chain Lightning, Earthquake. Ascendance, or excuse me, Tempest proc, use that. More Chain Lightnings, Earth Shock, another Tempest proc, use that. Chain Lightnings, and Earthquake. So not a whole lot different going on there from the previous build to this one. And I think this is actually a good time for me to mention, don't worry about the damage numbers and compare them directly. There are so many other little procs that are going on between each of these clips, as well as you can see I have consumables on this one, but I won't have it for the next one. Don't worry about the damage. All of these are perfectly fine to use in AoE. Your damage is going to vary quite a bit by what kind of procs you get, so don't look at the damage that I'm doing down here in the corner as any kind of indication of one being better than the other, but do play the one that you feel the most comfortable with it. That is what I would definitely say. But again, we're just Chain Lightning, Earth Shocking, and Earthquaking, going back and forth between those two things, and still using our Tempests whenever they proc. Very simple. It takes a little bit more... it's a little bit more involved, especially if you're wanting to maximize your lightning rods. As you see, I'm having to, if you want to rewatch those clips, I'm having to constantly pay attention to which ones are about to expire to figure out which ones I'm putting my Earth Shock on. Sometimes I miss if I click on one and I meant to click on something else. Sometimes you can miss those. It can get a little frustrating. That might drag your attention away from dodging mechanics. So use at your own risk. Sometimes it's better just not to worry too much about the lightning rod spread, but you will increase your damage overall if you do that. So just one more thing to mention with that, and we'll go ahead and move on to the Earthshock, Liquid Magma Totem, and Primordial Wave build. All right, moving into that Earthshock, Liquid Magma Totem, and Primordial Wave build, it plays very similarly to the Smooth Brain build. It just has that added package of Flame Shock spreading and Primordial Wave, but overall, very easy playstyle. The opener is a little bit different, obviously, because we have those Flame Shocks. So what we're going to do is, as the tank is gathering things up, we're going to be using our Stormkeeper to just go ahead and get it on cooldown, as long as it won't expire before you get a chance to use the charges. And then we're going to go ahead and start our Flame Shock spreading. So I'm going to drop a Liquid Magma Totem, and for a small pack like this, I'm just going to manually target one, put Flame Shock on it, put Primordial Wave on the other. Once I've got all my Flame Shock spread, then I'll go into Storm Elemental and Ascendance. But yeah, let's say it's a bigger pack. What you can do is, or it's either if it's a bigger pack or the tank is taking a really long time to kind of gather everything up, you can drop a Liquid Magma Totem, reset it with Totemic Recall from the class tree, which instantly resets the cooldown on your Primordial Wave as long as you use it right afterward. Put down another Liquid Magma Totem, and then you can get out a maximum of 6 Flame Shocks without having to worry too much about individually targeting them. So you could do it that way as well. But then the next thing we're going to do is drop our Storm Elemental. We're going to use our Ascendance first, and then we're going to trigger Primordial Wave while we're in Ascendance. That way those Lava Bursts get that added benefit of Ascendance as well. So that's the whole opener. And I know that sounds really complicated, just kind of going through each individual step, but it's really not that complicated. I'll just go through just talking all the way through it, each individual step of this. Stormkeeper, as we're getting ready to start dotting things up, we're going to be dropping our Liquid Magma Totem and start spreading out our Flame Shocks. use our Storm Elemental, use our Ascendance, and then finally use our Lava Burst. And that triggers that Primordial Wave, gives us that bonus haste, and now we can treat the whole rest of the playstyle as if we were playing Smooth Brain. So all we're doing is just dropping Earthquakes, using Chain Lightnings, and reacting to Tempest procs, and using those pretty much as you get them. So Earthquake, Chain Lightning, Earthquake, Earthquake, there's a Tempest, Earthquake, Earthquake, Chain Lightning, Earthquake, Tempest. That's all we're doing here. There's no anything. It's just basically 3 buttons total. It's either Chain Lightning, Earthquake, or Tempest. And then obviously as we're getting close to the end of an Ascendance window, we want to try to get as many Earthquakes out as we can. So 1, 2, just basically finishing it off with those spenders. And then we are back done with the Ascendance window. So as we're finishing the Ascendance window, you'll notice the Flame Shocks have fallen off. I've got Liquid Magma Totem coming off cooldown, and I've got Primordial Wave coming up in 4 seconds. So what I'm going to do here is we're going to go ahead and drop our Liquid Magma Totem, find one that doesn't have a Flame Shock on it, manually cast it on that one. Primordial Wave is now off cooldown now. Find one more, Primordial Wave, Lava Burst, and then back to the Smooth Brain idea, Chain Lightning and Earthquake, Chain Lightning and Earthquake, Tempest when it is available. And that's the entire playstyle. Very, very simple in AoE to pull this off. Just add a little bit added complexity of the Liquid Magma Totem and Flame Shock spreading with the Primordial Wave, but really, really a easy progression up from the Smooth Brain build if this is a playstyle you like, and if you don't like having to play Echoes of the Great Sundering, still a decent playstyle to play with. So with that being said, we'll get into the last build, which is the Chinese build. All right, so for this build, it's kind of the exact same thing as the Earthshock, Liquid Magma Totem, and Primordial Wave build, except this build is very much designed for priority targets and trying to burst down that one target that you're trying to focus on while still doing cleave around it. So we're going to treat it like that. The opener is the exact same as with that Liquid Magma Totem build. So we're going to be using our Stormkeeper. We're going to be spreading those Flame Shocks, Primordial Wave, then using our Storm Elemental, then using our Ascendance, and then using Lava Burst. And then from here, again, we're going to be treating this like we have that one target that needs to die. So we're going to stay on that one target here. We're going to be using our Elemental Blast as a first spender and going back and forth between that and Earthquake, and then spending Chain Lightnings and Tempest as we have them available. So Chain Lightning, Tempest, Elemental Blast, Chain Lightning, Earthquake, or Tempest, Earthquake, Elemental Blast, Chain Lightning, Earthquake, Chain Lightnings, more Chain Lightnings, a bunch of Chain Lightnings, another Elemental Blast, Chain Lightning, Earthquake, Tempest, Elemental Blast, Chain Lightning, Earthquake. And then here we have another Liquid Magma Totem and Primordial Wave package ready to go. Liquid Magma Totem is now off cooldown. Same thing as like with the Earthshock package, or when the Earthshock Liquid Magma Totem Primordial Wave build. So here we're going to be dropping that Liquid Magma Totem, get a Flame Shock, get that Primordial Wave out, Lava Burst, Earthquake, Elemental Blast, Earthquake. Get that Tempest out there, and then Chain Lightning. So a little bit more going on here, but you notice I'm just kind of sticking on that one target. It's going to be hard. You can treat this kind of just a normal AoE build if you want, and spread out those Tempest lightning rods. However, because we don't have the extended duration on the lightning rod like we do in the other builds, they're not going to last as long, and the benefit of doing that will be lessened. It still will be worth doing if you're talking about just general AoE, but this point of this build is kind of just to focus in on that one target that needs to die while still doing good relevant AoE to everything around it. So that's the real purpose of this build. Again, fairly simple, but this is definitely the one that has the most going on. Because you're doing that Echoes of the Great Sundering playstyle, you're doing the Flame Shock spreading with Liquid Magma Totem and Primordial Wave, and then you also have the added unfortunate non-benefit of having to actually cast Elemental Blast. It costs more Maelstrom to get up to that, so it can feel a little bit less flexible with movement. However, I do think it is worth playing in those situations where you need more single target or more priority target damage, which is the reason for this build. So with that being said, we're going to talk about some single target situations for these builds real quick. All right, so continuing with that same build going into single target, the big difference between this and the raid build is because we have Echoes of the Great Sundering, we're going to be going back and forth between our spenders and Earthquake, even in single target. That's a big difference from previous times where Echoes wasn't always used in single target. It is always used at the moment. So that's the only real difference we're going to be seeing coming from the raid build to this one. We don't really need to talk about it, but we'll talk about it real quickly. It's going to be that same opener of Stormkeeper into Storm Elemental, Primordial Wave into Ascendance into Lava Burst, doing that pretty much every time with pretty much every build if you have Primordial Wave. Now we're just going to be using things as we get them. So Lava Burst and Lightning Bolt going back and forth. In a situation like this, where you're having to build your Maelstrom up from nothing, it can kind of take a while to get that first Lightning Rod out. In a Mythic Plus environment, what you really want to be doing going into a boss is building up a little bit of Maelstrom before you get to the boss on that last pack, before you get to the boss, so you're not going in completely dry. That way you can get that Lightning Rod out ASAP. And you can use those lightning bolts with lightning rod, getting yourself just a little bit extra damage. But in this situation, starting from dry, sometimes you just gotta go with the flow. Sometimes you can get procs that will help you build that Maelstrom up quicker. In this situation, I didn't really get them. Unfortunate. But moving on, I got an Ice Fury proc, so I'm going to use that. Lava Burst into Elemental Blast. Some more lightning bolts. I'm going to do an Earthquake real quick first before I do this next Ice Fury, because I got another one using that. More lightning bolts. I'm coming up to the end of my Ascendance window, but I'm going to try to get this Elemental Blast under the effect of Master the Elements by waiting for this next Lava Burst. I do get one, so Lava Burst into Elemental Blast. I use Nature's Swiftness to get it out extra quickly. You can use that too, just to get things out super quickly if you need to. And I get one more Lightning Bolt before it ends. Continuing on with the normal pace of play, so nothing really changes outside of Ascendance. So I get one more Ice Fury here, and what I'm going to do to proc the Fusion of the Elements is I'm actually going to put down Liquid Magma Totem because it counts as both. So you'll see I'll drop Liquid Magma Totem, counts as both. It's still useful to use in single target because we have it. Might as well throw it out there and use it as a trigger. You can also use it as a way, as a movement ability. If a boss has adds, you can save it to line up with ad spawns. So that's just another way of using it. But if it's a pure single target situation, I like using it for proccing Fusion if you are trying to quickly get that out. Get another Lava Burst. I have Earthquake ready to go. It's empowered, so Lava Burst, Earthquake. Get an Ascendance proc. This is actually a kind of a bad Ascendance proc because the next thing we want to spend it on, or spend our Maelstrom on, is Elemental Blast, but we're nowhere close to getting an Elemental Blast out. Unfortunately, this will happen sometimes where you just can't quite get a very good Ascendance window, which is why it's always good to try to pool your Maelstrom up. So if you do proc an Ascendance, you can get some spinners in that window. But you will have bad periods of time like that where it just procs in the wrong place and you don't get a whole lot out of your Ascendance. So just in general, you want to be kind of pooling Maelstrom to some degree, so when they do proc, you have things to spend in there. But again, we don't need to talk about this too much more because of the fact it's very similar to the playstyle for the raid build. It's really the only difference between that and this is just going back and forth between Elemental Blast and Earthquake. You're not having to do anything crazy. You're just adding that in. So we'll talk about one more single target build or a single target situation for a Mythic Plus build, which is the Smooth Brain build, just to show you how different it is when you pull out the Echoes of the Great Sundering and the Primordial Wave package. So we'll talk about that next. All right, so getting into that Smooth Brain build, just like the other builds so far, it's going to be very similar. It's just not going to have Primordial Wave. It's not going to have Echoes of the Great Sundering. So it's going to be fairly pared down compared to the other one. So here we're going to start off with Stormkeeper into Storm Elemental, and we're just going to go Ascendance right away. Go back and forth, Lava Burst and Lightning Bolt. We do proc in a Tempest really early, so we get that Lightning Rod on the target really quickly. Don't forget that that also applies your Lightning Rod. So we're going to get that on fairly quickly here. I do get an Ice Fury, so I'm going to use that right away. And now I have nothing left except just getting out as many Lightning Bolts as possible. Got another Tempest as well. So a whole bunch of Lightning Bolts. Lava Burst came off cooldown, using that immediately. Bunch of Lightning Bolts. Got another Lava Burst proc. And here, as we're getting close to the end of Ascendance, we're going to just try to spam out some Earth Shocks if we can, and then that's it for the first window. Now we're back to that same priority. If you have a Lava Burst, go ahead and use it, essentially. Try to line those up with Earth Shock if you can, but it's not a big deal if you can't either. Play around your Ice Furies. If you get an Ice Fury, try to get a Lava Burst and an Earth Shock or a Lightning Bolt or a Flame Shock. Flame Shock will also do it as well. Here, like for instance right here, I had an Ice Fury proc right as my Flame Shock's ending, so I can Ice Fury into Flame Shock, and that immediately triggers it. We don't have to think about it too hard. Lava Burst into Earth Shock, more Lightning Bolts, and that's really just it. It's a very, very simple playstyle when you're just doing it this way. In fact, I'd say all of the playstyles are fairly easy to work your head around. It's just working with the modular approach that Elemental Shaman is now. Kind of all the builds play the same. It's just a question of if you're adding in the Primordial Wave package or the Echoes of the Great Sundering package or both. So that's pretty much it. Don't need to overcomplicate it too much. So Yeah, I'd say any of these builds are worth playing around with. Again, the so-called Chinese build, I literally don't have any other name for it, so that's just what we're calling it. Is the only one I would suggest not playing with unless you're doing like super high keys. There are a bunch of other builds out there. I want to stress this point. There's a bunch of other builds out there that you can play moving one or two talents, but those are the main four archetypes that you'll see in Mythic Plus. So one of those four things, you can move some talent points around. If you don't like the Elemental Blast portion of that previous build that we were talking about, switch it out with Earthshock. I guarantee you it'll still probably play fairly well. But yeah, mix and match. There's some other builds out there. Petco has a build that he believes is really, really good. Can play around with that one. That's basically, if I remember correctly, it's the same kind of idea of the Elemental Blast and Echoes of the Great Sundering / Liquid Magma Totem build. Very similar to that in playstyle. So give that a shot as well. But yeah, those are basically all the builds. So now we'll talk about a couple more things like stats and trinkets and the utility the class brings. All right, moving on to utility and the class side of the tree. Basically, you want to be taking every single defensive that you possibly have access to. The big things here are Astral Shift and Plains Traveler. There's not really ever a case to take Astral Bulwark. It's just not quite useful as having Astral Shift a little bit more often. Earth Elemental, your Nature's Guardian, and your Stone Bulwark Totem always are in every single build that I pretty much make. Same thing with Primordial Bond. Just taking less damage is going to be something that you're going to be trying to do as often as you can. I also, in that same vein, like to always take Earth Shield and Elemental Orbit if I can, just getting just a little bit more healing and being able to reapply Earth Shield either in between packs if you're in Mythic Plus, or even just at the start of the fight in a raid, and then just using it as a movement cooldown. If you don't have anything useful while you're trying to move, you can reapply Earth Shield. Very useful for that. Ancestral Guidance is an extremely powerful cooldown now that Elemental Shaman is a cooldown based class with Ascendance. You can basically, if you pair this up with Ascendance during periods of high damage in like Mythic Plus or Raid for that matter, you can get a decent amount of healing out through this, especially in AoE. So highly recommend that in all your builds. For Mythic Plus, things like Thunderstorm with Thundershock is really good for an extra stop. Your Capacitor Totem, all of these things are super useful. Cleanse Spirit and Tremor Totem both have a place in Season 1, depending on the dungeon. Make sure you're looking at dungeon guides on which ones to use this for. It's like really super good for a Grim Battle or for Stone Vault. Those are good places to have it. Even Siege of Borealis, there's some curses in there that can really help your tank out with by just taking that 1 point. Same thing with Tremor Totem, like for Mist of Tyr and Scythe, being able to use that on the first boss. There's a lot of good utility in here that you can use. You can also use the Windrush Totem with your where is it? Is it the Jetstream? Yeah, Jetstream with Windrush Totem allows you to cleanse off any snares for an entire group that stands in your Windrush Totem. So like the second boss of City of Threads, you can actually remove that after they do the line attack on you and you're slowed for a little bit. That can just cleanse it off of your entire group. Very useful for that. So there's a ton of utility here that Shaman brings, and you can mix and match what you need based on your current target, whether that be Mythic Plus, a specific dungeon, or for raid. But there's a lot here. Poison Cleanse Totem, something else I didn't mention. It is a 2-minute cooldown now, but it's still super useful in the dungeons that do have poison. For instance, Arakara. There's a bunch of poisons throughout there, and that can be super useful having that Poison Cleanse Totem. As well as also in City of Threads, there's that one specific big scarab dude that puts poison on everyone. Super useful for that as well. So lots of utility that Shaman can bring, and just make sure that you're customizing it specifically to the instance that you're running, but make sure you're always taking your defensives as well. Moving on, we're going to be talking about stats. I'm waiting this long into the video to finally mention it, but it's basically mastery, haste, critical strike, and then versatility. But that being said, don't just adhere to that blindly. Make sure you're simming your gear with a site like Raidbots so you can get a more accurate sense of what your character actually needs for what situation, whether that be single target or for Mythic Plus. In Mythic Plus, critical strike is going to be much higher in value than it is in single target with a raid build or something like that. So make sure you're simming your gear. But in general, mastery, haste, critical strike, versatility as a general guideline. Talking about trinkets, because it's actually important for once, you can probably have just about anything in the second slot. Unbound Changeling is what I use because it's very good. I have it on the Mythic track, and I have it with the Mastery proc. But the real thing that you need to be worried about is Spymaster's Web. You need to be getting this on any difficulty, if it's LFR, normal, heroic, or mythic if you can get to that point. Spymaster's Web is the best trinket in the game for any burst class like Elemental Shaman is now, so make sure you're grabbing one even if it's on LFR difficulty. Basically, the way you're going to be playing with this is if it's a single target boss, you're basically just going to be getting stacks throughout the fight, and then you want to use it one time with the second ascendance that you get through that fight right towards the end of the fight. You basically kind of delay your cooldowns if you're not capable of getting a third ascendance. If the fight time is like say 4.5 minutes, you kind of hold onto it and use it right before the end, so you get the full duration of Storm Elemental and Ascendance, and then the fight ends somewhere close to right after those things expire. That's kind of what you're aiming for in a single target environment. I will say on super long fights, like something like Kaiveza that can be like 6.5 minutes long, you can use your Spymasters in both the second Ascendance and the third Ascendance. You can even use it with one stack right off the bat with your first Ascendance. You can do that too. I typically prefer the style of just holding it, building up those stacks all the way through the fight, and then using it towards the end. But because of how powerful Ascendance is, using it with your second and third Ascendance does seem to be worth doing. But that being said, it's hard to look at all the data that I've seen out there because of the fact that there's so many other things going on. DRE procs, Aftershock procs are also factoring into that. That being said, the main takeaway with Spymaster's Web is make sure you're using it with your Ascendance. That's really the big thing. Make sure you're stacking it up to 40 and use it with your Ascendance to get the maximum value. Same thing is said about it in Mythic Plus. If you have a super dangerous pack that you're trying to kill and you want to be burning it as quickly as possible, you're lining your cooldowns up and then using it there and just blasting it into oblivion and then stacking it back up for the next time that your Ascendance window happens. That's something that you can do with a Spymaster's Web. It's going to absolutely turbocharge your damage and is absolutely, it's not required, but I would say that if you really want to be getting the most out of your Elemental Shaman, make sure you're trying every week, at least get into LFR and try to pick one of these up. And that's pretty much everything I have to talk about. Like I said, there's plenty other variations out there. If the build that you like playing isn't exactly the ones that I posted here, they're probably some version of the ones that we talked about, whether that include Echoes of the Great Sundering, Liquid Magma Totem, Primordial Wave, or that Supercharged Conduit. All of those things are kind of the bedrock of Elemental, and you're just mixing out pieces. Maybe 1 or 2 talent points different if you don't like using Elemental Blast, using Earthshock, etc., etc. So hopefully you guys enjoyed the video. If you have any questions, feel free to hit me up on Discord. I also stream at Twitch at twitch.tv/Ridmark, so feel free to give me a follow there if that's something that might be interesting to you as well. But other than that, guys, again, I hope you guys enjoyed the video, and I'll see you in the next one.